Well, we're going to move on to our next panel. Our next panel of new fellows will be discussing how to adapt to climate change. We have seen in the last few years fires, floods that are very real representations of the impact of climate change that we're seeing right here in Australia. To guide this conversation, we have ATSE's President-elect, Dr. Catherine Woodthorpe. Catherine. Joining Catherine will be Dr. Beth Fulton, Senior Principal Research Scientist, CSIRO. Dr. Beth Fulton is a trailblazer in sustainable management of marine environments. Her whole-of-life systems modeling tools are considered world's best by UN Food and Agricultural Organization. Professor Huijin Zhao, Director of the Center for Catalysis and Clean Energy at Griffith University. Professor Zhao is an eminent researcher in sensing technology. He has developed innovative chemical, microbiological, and nanotechnological approaches to understanding pollutants in aquatic environment and soils. Maureen York, the Executive General Manager of Systems Design, Australian Energy Market Operator. Maureen York is trained as an electrical engineer and has worked in Australia's energy sector for more than 30 years. She's focused on electricity because the combination of its technical complexity and community service appealed to her. And Dr. Nicholas Austin at Water Trust Australia Limited. Dr. Austin is a hydrologist by training, bridging agriculture and engineering in the critical area of water. From his earliest appointments in water policy reform, Nick has shown an exceptional ability to build partnerships between government, businesses, and society for the common good. So please join with me in welcoming our next panel.
So I think this panel is going to segue nicely from where we got to with the earlier discussion. They segued rather from mitigation into adaptation, and we're going to take that theme further forward. I'm first going to start by asking each of our panelists, given their particular areas of expertise, what's their approach to adapting to this climate change that's coming towards us at a rate of knots?
So I've spent about 30 years helping create tools for people to understand how to get to desirable futures. So we're a 2D, an animal, a land animal that lives in the 2D world, and we've evolved to think in very short time scales. We use culture to give us the long-term perspective, but individually it takes us our entire lifetime to basically get new messages into our head. So the way that we do that faster though is that we play. So that's how we create the tools. So effectively create models for people to play what that future would look like, because we ultimately live on an ocean planet that is 3D in a completely alien environment to what we do. So people have said that counting fish, understanding the ocean should be just as easy as understanding a forest, except the fish are invisible and they move around. And we can't actually see them because the water is a nice blanket. So finding tools to help us understand that at a rate that we can deal with is really important, because we can't take a whole generation to learn at a time anymore. Australia's already lost 45% of its marine habitats. It's living right at it's the canary in the coal mine. This is what the rest of the world will be having to deal with within the next decade, a couple of decades. So we don't have the time, so that's why we need the tools to basically live it fast so that we don't make the mistakes in the real world that we can make inside the model world.
And also that oceans take up a lot of carbon, both in the physical approach of, the physical science side of it, but also in the biological sciences with marine phytoplankton and other enormous amounts of biomass that are actually helping us fight the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So your work's critical.
Yeah, 80% of the oxygen that's produced around the world is all still coming out of the oceans. So we don't want to mess it up.
Indeed. Huijin.
Yes, so by training I'm a chemist. So quite a few years ago we realized it doesn't matter we like it or not, we have to adapt the climate change. So that's why we develop a lot of sensors, and we are learning the climate change, and to do the adaptations we need to know what exactly happens in nature. So that's why we develop a range of sensors at least we can probe what is happening there. So that's one area of research we are doing. On the other hand, actually, in my center, the large capacity has been derived to develop enable technological solutions for the renewable energy and environment. So we talk a lot about adaptations in terms of energy from last panel and other things. But if you look at, there's another sector is quite important. Because of climate change, we have to do things differently. That's called adaptation. So the one important thing is for manufacturing. So we have been used the petroleum stock as raw materials to make almost everything you see around you, okay? And if in the future we say the climate really come to the stage we need to go even negative carbon emissions, so you can't use petroleum as a feedstock to make these things. But we still have to, life still going on, we still have to do those things. That's why we start a new research field. And we use biomass, which is cheap and plentiful and renewable on Earth. And also the simple small molecules on Earth like nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. And for, we call them a green production of fuels and chemicals. Especially the chemicals, we make quite a bit of effort in that areas. We hope this is some way to adapt the changes into the future. Thank you.
And hopefully we'll also bring more manufacturing back to Australia if our technology is underpinning that.
Yes, that's for sure. And for that, I want to add, it's not just the technological solutions we need to develop in this country. And we also need to nurture the next generation scientists and technology capabilities. And this is probably equally important than technological advances. So.
And Merin, at AEMO, you're right up the pointy end. Everybody's looking at you to implement more renewable energy. So what are you bringing to the picture in terms of how we're actually going to manage that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got a couple of slides which I'm hoping might be able to be up. No. So I'll just talk to it. I mean, we take very much an engineering approach, not surprising because we're a pretty technical engineering type of organisation. So we're looking at the near term, the medium term, and then the long term of how we would think about these things. So we've got to make this big transition to net zero energy system by 2050 is our target, and that's net zero, not 00, just to be clear. There's quite a big difference between those things. But we also need to kind of project ourselves ahead and then look back. And so we take the two approaches of, well, how do we get from where we are, knowing we've got to keep the lights on, we've got to keep the power flowing, because without it, it's pretty grim. But we also don't want to be blindsided by just doing things incrementally, because that will be really challenging to get there. But if we do project forward to 2050, and the previous panel also talked to this, and this is work that AEMO's developed over quite a period of time, including with Alex Swanhouse, who was chairing the previous panel, just talking about grid scale wind and solar generation. If we project from now, we've got about 16 gigawatts of grid scale wind and solar, and in 2050, we need 141 gigawatts connected to the grid. So that's a 9-fold increase. And that's obviously part of being able to close down the fossil fueled generators, particularly the coal-fired generators that currently deliver electricity into the system. We project that distributed solar PV in people's houses will increase 5-fold over that period. So from 15 gigawatts we have now to about 69 gigawatts in 2050, and that's a big amount that's on people's rooftops feeding into the system. We also project that electricity usage from the grid will nearly double, and that's because of decarbonisation in gas and transport, obviously. So to decarbonise that and use electricity instead, the usage from the grid will double, and that to support all of that, we will need storage capacity, and we talked about batteries before, potentially hydrogen or electricity storage in the form of hydrogen, but also larger types of plants like pumped hydro and other hydro sources which are actually more controllable. So we need all kinds of depth of storage, and by depth I mean the duration of the amount of energy that they can store and then feed back into the system. So we think about this challenge of keeping this amazing engineering machine of the electricity system running like flying a plane. So all of us as electricity consumers are the passengers on this plane that needs to fly continuously. On one wing we've got our 2 big engines currently, and we're changing that out for, I don't know, 20, 50 large grid scale solar and wind generators while we're flying. So we can't stop and turn it off and then recommission it. We've got to keep it flying. We're building the plane, we're growing it as we fly along. And on the other wing, we're changing out our 2 big engines for what is currently 3 million solar rooftops and will become 10 million solar rooftops. And all of those are controlled by all of us. And we're expecting that to also be able to feed into the grid and keep the whole thing stable and flying along at the same time as it grows. So that's our engineering challenge. We love it. And we, like Alex said earlier, we've got the smartest people in the world here. We've got a big challenge though, and yeah, we're really looking forward to leaning into it and making it all happen.
And you didn't even touch on where the grid is. You know, from great lumps in the Hunter Valley and the Latrobe and similarly in other states, to suddenly all of our generation being at the thin end of the pipe, not the fat end of the pipe. So maybe we'll tackle a bit more of that a bit later. And so, Nick, we've gone through manufacturing, we've looked at our oceans, we've looked at our energy systems, or electricity systems specifically, but you're really worried about our water systems. So where does your area of expertise feed into this?
Thanks, Catherine. Maybe I'll answer that question perhaps by giving a thumbnail sketch of my own journey in agriculture and water and some of the observations from that as they relate to climate adaptation. So I come from a farming background, born in South Australia. My brother is still farming and battling with a changing climate and what that brings. I studied agricultural engineering in Melbourne University and fell into a career in research in water by chance. I graduated in the middle of the recession Australia had to have in the early 90s. My planned career in the private sector took a radical turn in a different direction, and it was incredibly fortunate. I landed in a research career without really knowing what that meant or what I was signing up to, and I had several wonderful years working in water research in northern Victoria, and at the time, as now, funding for research was scarce, but it coincided with the blue-green algal blooms in the Darling Basin, and we see the consequences of development and a changing climate and a whole lot of factors on water regimes and the environmental health of riverine ecosystem. And so I was probably one of a small number who benefited from that period, because all of a sudden funding flowed towards water research, and I was involved in tracking nitrogen and phosphorus movement out of that work. And my first learning is just that misalignment between the nature of funding and long-term intractable challenges and how we can address that. In water, sometimes referred to as the hydroillogical cycle, with periods of drought and funding, and of course, perhaps now also with periods of flooding. Moving from that, the Murray-Darling Basin Ministerial Council introduced a cap on diversions from the Murray-Darling Basin, in part as a consequence of clear evidence of over-extraction. And we saw, again, really renewed interest in water policy without knowing what policy was, but out of frustration that the research was not finding its way into useful decision-making, I became involved in water policy. And my second learning was really around the challenge in getting that effective interface, and that's no news to anyone in this audience or on this panel, but it continues to be a focus of my work currently. I moved from the water policy space, and as happens gradually through more management roles in science and research in the New South Wales Department and in agriculture, into the international space, heading up the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, those who don't know of the organisation, a small but incredibly important part of Australia's development program, which partners Australia's capability that we've been hearing a lot about, with that in developing countries, particularly in our near neighbourhood, countries that are disproportionately impacted by a changing climate, small island developing states or populous nations like Indonesia, not far to our north. Incredibly important role, and what that taught me was the calibre of Australian capability and the way that's perceived in agriculture and in development in the near neighbourhood, and the opportunity to do more in that space, to build relationships, but also to learn from and share knowledge with counterparts in our neighbourhood, and particularly in developing countries. And the changing climate in all aspects of inequality exacerbates inequality. And so we see a particular need for adaptation solutions in developing countries and low-income countries, and particularly for smallholder agriculture. So the world committed to $100 billion annual financing for development for climate change responses, mitigation and adaptation. That was in 2009. By 2020 was the commitment, fell quite a long way short. And of that financing, the vast proportion goes into mitigation, not adaptation. Of the adaptation component, only about 1.7% actually flows through into smallholder agriculture. So these are hundreds of millions of smallholder farms across low-income countries that are making a very small contribution, if any, to the climate change problem, but are disproportionately impacted. So there's a huge need and a tremendous opportunity to address that imbalance, including through the knowledge and smarts from countries like Australia, but as well as resources from the global community.
It's a really important point you make about the inequality of the impacts of climate change across the world and across socio-economic groups. And it's, for me, it's such a responsibility of Australia, Australians, and then minds like we have in the Academy to do what we can to change that paradigm, because we have within our Academy the brightest minds in Australia in applied sciences, technology and engineering, and so we are probably the best place to actually engender ideas from. And this set of New Fellows panels are a great example of the sort of minds, research and technologies that we can tap into. So I might drop back to you, Hui-Jun, about what are the specific things that we are already doing to improve our manufacturing processes and reduce our reliance on the inputs from, for example, the petrochemical industry?
That's a very big question. I don't know if I can give you a broad picture, but I'll try. I think Australia does have very good capabilities, and we have started quite early on, and once we noticed the climate change is occurring. At the moment, I think it's mainly in Australian space, and we are doing is not come to the commercialization stage yet, but it's in the research and the development stage. So, like hydrogen has been emphasized everywhere and by every level of government and research organizations. But in terms of how to go from here, I think there's the last panel say a lot of things, and the hydrogen is not only solution for the future. There's many other things, and also I think the Australia now realize the hydrogen is not just for energy applications or fertilizations. Okay, you can directly burn ammonia to save the transportations. You can directly burn ammonia as the fuel. That's already done that in the world, and it's feasible. But there's many other applications, like people probably don't know that there's a very large chemical manufacture sector they call hydrogenation reactions. A lot of things you make here is through that reaction process. They require hydrogen, and which is the largest greenhouse emission from chemical manufacture. And currently they use the petroleum feedstock to make the hydrogen. So if we can use the clean hydrogen from water splitting, renewable electricity driven one for this manufacture, it's not just create a sector that reduce the greenhouse emission. I think the most important thing is you create a new way of making things, which is we call adaptations. So I think there's a lot of things going on in Australia, and I truly believe Australia can make a big contributions in this sector. So.
Thanks very much, and that leads us back to Merrin, maybe, in that you were talking about not only the need to change our current electricity usage to renewables, but the fact that our electricity usage is going to go up, whether it's electrified transport or indeed, as we've just heard, from producing hydrogen as a feedstock, a fuel, and all the other things. And I'm actually going to start turning to the questions here because they're so much smarter than me. And there's at least a couple of them who are asking, John Bell and Gunilla Burrows, amongst others, asking about offshore wind, for example. So where's that up to?
So one of the things with the planning work that we do is it's based on a least cost projection. So the way in which we develop our 2050 plan is to set effectively a carbon budget. So we say we've got to get to net zero by 2050. We factor in temperature rise, which effectively delivers a trajectory for how quickly you've got to reduce the fossil fuel generation in the energy sector. So if you want to have a smaller temperature rise, you need to phase that out more quickly. We then get our generation costing data effectively from the CSIRO through our GenCost database, which is all publicly available. It's updated once a year, or it might be every 2 years. And part of that is that the cost of offshore wind is still above the cost of onshore wind. Not really surprising there. And that until those costs effectively come down a bit further, or there are other drivers that get factored in, such as social licence, land usage, government policy, then we will just continue to take a least cost approach. And so all different types of generation opportunities exist in the cost database. We will just drive out coal-fired generation and in renewable generation on a cost stack until we meet the reliability standards. So in the ISP modelling, we will always meet the reliability standard that's required, in contrast to some of our other analysis, which actually says, well, what's actually committed and what's really going on, and then that drives a quite different outlook.
So if I can
go ahead,
jump
please.
into that though.
Do.
So it's also a very rapidly changing space. One of Australia's biggest CRCs is called the Blue Economy CRC, which is about offshore energy generation, not just wind, but all different kinds of energy generation, both to decarbonise offshore industries, because it's our largest growing industry base at 11% a year. The blue economy is kind of the future. Everything we do on land for the last 10,000 years is migrating into the ocean. So we can't create a new problem by powering that with diesel. So they're doing things like co-locating marine renewable energy and aquaculture in deep water. They now run a large amount of King Island off what's called wave swell, where you have a man-made blowhole and the tides and waves going up and down that generate. So it's a brand new area that's growing very, very rapidly, and I think its costs will come down to better feature into future projections, but it's a really rapidly changing space. It's well done in Europe already, but the worst day in Australia is better than by about 2 to 5 times, I think it is, than the best day in Europe, because we have the third largest EEZ, but we also have no other land. Pretty much around, if you go around the bottom of the ocean, you get hit by Australia. Is about the only place you hit land. So we have very high winds, we have very high waves. So there's a huge energy potential there. We're still trying to figure out how to crack it.
Yes, and wave energy's been, I was on the board of ARENA, and wave energy is still a dogged problem that we haven't, because of the forces and problems, engineering problems that we have with that. Though the one on King Island, if I'm right in thinking, is actually quite old. It's some technology that was put in, when I say quite old, 10 years or more ago?
Yeah, so it's got to, from the prototype stage actually to deployment stage, and that's been running for I think 18 months, 2 years now. It just looks like a little boat that's moored off the coast, but it's actually generating, I think, enough to run 50 or 200 houses or something like that.
Yeah, and to your point about the blue economy, CRC, we have another of our new fellows talking later today about who comes from the marine bioproducts new CRC. So again, whole new industries that Australia can tap into to both lead our own economic future, but importantly also with products that are actually decarbonising the atmosphere by growing more stuff that we can sell, or good old asparaginopsis that's getting a lot of press these days to try and reduce cow burps. So there's a lot going on in Australia, and I think we undersell ourselves in terms of the opportunities that exist for us to really be at the forefront of so many different areas of manufacturing and technology. On the water space, so maybe going back to your earlier point about how do we then utilise those to enable the rest of the world to also manage what they're facing. You know, we think of countries like Bangladesh, where their agricultural economy is just facing the biggest disaster in terms of sea level rise and the resultant storms and so on. So how do Australian technologies get deployed? How can we help those economies and those countries to cope with what we've contributed really substantially to, unlike them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we're super conscious of floods at the moment in Australia, but when we look, as you say, to Bangladesh, or you look to Pakistan with 1,700 people killed and extreme monsoons and glacial melt, it puts some relativity in the challenges, and I think the importance of technology, including the ability to continue to produce food under those conditions, incredibly important. And Australia has capability in that space, including in better livestock, better crop varieties, and the opportunity to find ways in which they can reach smallholder farmers, to be able to produce under periods of flooded conditions or periods where there's more extreme droughts. I think there's always a desire to move towards infrastructure solutions, and in the rich world, that's less clear the opportunity relative to developing countries, low-income countries, where there's an enormous need for infrastructure development for things that we take for granted here, in being able to adapt to a changing climate, and of course that has important implications for financing and there are certain criticisms of dam development, and I think there have been periods of a desire, as we hear in periods of drought here in Australia, for increasing dams, and then again in periods of flood for increasing dams. It's less clear in Australia than it is in countries where there's been little or no investment in infrastructure. And so I think the point I'm making is the criticality of understanding context and not trying to impose a model from a different paradigm and expecting it to work, but work to really understand the different needs and perspectives. And perhaps that takes me to the work I'm involved with Water Trust here in Australia. And Catherine, to your question around water more specifically, the need to find new ways to engage around water decision making, because inevitably questions around water are contested and complex, and in a changing climate increasingly so, where there's needs to redress historic disadvantage, needs to accommodate increasing demands for industry, urban uses, agriculture, and increasing recognition of environmental needs. And so that requires new ways to engage, new ways to, in a structured way, bring knowledge, expert knowledge, information and science into the debate. To Professor Kim Carr's observations this morning around declining trust in institutions charged with making those decisions, there's a desperate need to find ways to rebuild trust, and part of those ways will include co-creation and co-design of solutions and policy options for better managing finite and increasingly variable and scarce water resources.
Interesting. I'm the daughter of a water engineer from places with scarce water resources. And so my father worked in Bahrain for many years as the manager of their water system. And the difference, we're so profligate with water in Australia, given what a dry continent we're on. And in their engineering at one stage, they dug up old irrigation trenches. They're all covered. And then you fly over Australia and you just see all of that water evaporating everywhere in areas where water is scarce. So solutions that have been around for those were 3,000 years old, those cisterns and those irrigation channels. We also need to look back sometimes and go, well, actually, what could we implement that's already in place? It's not always just brand new technology as well. But also doing more with less always is really interesting. I'll stick with you for a moment because we'll keep a water theme for just a moment. And Snow Barlow has asked, so Nick and others might want to chip in and, do chip in. How do you see the seemingly dramatic increase in extreme climate events further destabilising the management of our scarce water resources? Should we build more dams? Should we raise our dams?
Thank you, Snow. I think I used the term...
Snow's good at dropping people in it.
I borrowed the term hydrological cycle before, and the reality of this land of droughts and flooding rains and opportunities where we're not in extremes of either to engage in new ways. The reality, as we face more extreme events, it gets more difficult to find consensus and find common ground, understand how we can bridge the partisan and often highly polarised positions around how water should be shared and used. And so I think in Australia, at least for the next little while, there is an opportunity to really explore new ways to engage in policy development that works towards a more evidence-informed and trust-based way of working. And that's between different levels of government, it's between industry and government, it's between environment, First Nations, each with legitimate and important priorities and aspirations around water, but currently without an effective way of engaging or bridging those different divides. And so there is a tremendous opportunity there to approach the process of sharing water and arriving at more enduring models of water allocation and distribution over time. And that gets much tougher when we're in the next drought, which is we're a day closer to that than we were yesterday. And I think we're in some ways fortunate relative to major river basins that cross national boundaries, and so this challenge is not unique to Australia, even though we experience some important extremes.
I might just
Go ahead. Yep.
add something. It's not specifically related to water, but it goes to things like drought and flooding. And just as we have more of those and those things are more severe, whether it's also relates to bushfires, this interaction and the interconnectedness of everything becomes more critical. And in the energy sector, we talk about how we can increase the resilience of the power system. And it's probably something that applies to water as well, because when you get floods, the quality of the water is impacted, and the water processing facilities might be flooded, and then then it's shortages of water, and of course everyone runs out and fills out another bottle, and it exacerbates that. And so, it's this interconnectedness of everything that we're seeing is increasing, and how we can try to factor in building more resilience without it costing a lot, because one way to build more resilience, of course, is to put more infrastructure in. But if we want to have a least cost solution that people can still afford to pay for and still delivers, electricity, just to use that, at a cost that people in Australia can manufacture from and all that kind of stuff. You know, we need to be very mindful of how we think about that and how we do it, and what people are willing to tolerate, if you like. And it's certainly, we experience in the electricity sector a greater willingness of people to tolerate things if there's a natural disaster than if it's just, I don't know, something that happens that was really avoidable. And so we're really trying to make sure that we're thinking about that from both sides as well, and how we can build resilience without necessarily just duplicating everything, because we won't be able to afford that. So it's
I chair Natural Hazards Research Australia and Energy Networks Australia is a member of it, so they really get that as a grouping. But yes, one of the worst things that happened after the fires went through? Mobiles went out, so nobody could get information unless they had a battery radio, but then the antenna were out, so unless they were on AM, they weren't able to receive the signals that could tell them what was going on. And electricity went out for ages, but also meant that their credit cards didn't work in the whole of Malakuta when they needed to just go and buy groceries. So all of those interconnected systems are absolutely crucial. And the more, so yes, anybody who wants to contribute to Natural Hazards Research Australia, we're a great research organisation. It came out of the CRC for bushfires and natural hazards. And interconnectedness, I mean, I'm sort of jumping across a bit, but interconnectedness is absolutely what you do. It might not be on land, and we might not be talking about resilience of infrastructure systems, but that modelling that you do to understand interconnectedness and the impacts of one thing down a whole chain of dominoes is absolutely critical, that sort of modelling, isn't it?
Yeah, so we're not very good as a human species at thinking about interconnectedness easily. We kind of need to see it play out, which is why we do it in model world, because the integration is really important for understanding not only the effects of something like an extreme event. So until the bushfires happened, the New South Wales Fisheries Service never realised that bushfire was probably the biggest threat to their fisheries. So they've done, you know, the marine estate now has looked at all the different interconnected threats, and the top 15 are all land-based to fisheries. Fisheries comes in, you know, way down the list of things that are a threat to fish, because there is such a huge connection across that coastal divide, so to speak, between what we call our coastal communities, which we want to be resilient, thriving human communities, but also the blue ribbon, in a way, in a sense, around Australia that was all the majority of fish and things live. So being able to actually visualise what that connection is, and we run a lot of games, in effect, where we sit down with local planners and we let them play out, or get people to be the opposite job. There's sayings in lots of people's cultures about walking another man's shoes. So you get the fishermen to say, if you were the government minister, how would you run the world? Get him to play it out, and the government minister's going to try to catch the fish. We had, excuse the language that's about to come, but we had one coastal planner goes, oh fuck, what I do in the car park really affects what happens on the reef. He'd never thought about it, he'd lived there for 30 years. So, you know, letting people play that out can really drive that home. Yeah.
It's the only way to make them actually understand the problem in real life, isn't it? Yeah, fantastic. I'm glad you said that word, not me. It's usually me, and I get in terrible trouble. We're coming close to the end of our session, literally just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to quickly see, there's one big elephant in the room. Janine has raised it. If we're talking about energy, the one that keeps coming up as the hot potato is nuclear. Is it, people like the word baseload, is there such a thing as baseload, or do we just change our thinking to dispatchable? And will nuclear, to your point about cost, ever be a realistic cost for Australia at this point in our history? And I'm sure everyone else will have an opinion too.
I would have been gobsmacked in a room of engineers and technology types if nuclear hadn't have come up, so I was waiting for it.
Save the best till last.
It always comes up with engineers. It's a good question. So there's pros and cons. At the moment, the cost database, just going back to that, doesn't drive nuclear in. It would not plant nuclear in Australia. And then on top of that, there's current policy settings that mean that there's nowhere that you put it in effect in our plan. So we develop our plan based on least cost, taking into account current policy settings. If those policy settings did change, then, and the cost came down, then at AEMO we're technology agnostic. It's really a least cost plan that we do. That said, we know that the size of generators, renewable generators, while they're getting larger, they're still small relative to the size of the current power stations. So if you think about, I'm trying to think of New South Wales power stations because we're in New South Wales, but you know, Bayswater or Liddell or some of those, Eraring, you know, they're 4 660 megawatt generators. Very large wind farms is one set of towers, wind turbines, that make up 600 megawatts. That's about the largest wind turbine. So it's not 4 of those all lined up next to each other connecting to one point. So it's going to be quite a different power system, and that whole concept of base load is not going to be a feature of the future. It is a shift to that concept of dispatchable, and whether that comes from hydro or other ones with controllable fuel sources, storage, and particularly synchronous storage will be very helpful. And then even in our net zero, because remember I said it's net zero in 2050, not 0, so we still have about 10 gigawatts of gas plant in our plan currently out to 2050. And that's specifically because we need some kind of dispatchable, and to replace that with storage of any depth would be off the cost chart. So that's just conceptually. Whether that's offset with clean hydrogen or other forms of offset, we don't go into the specifics of that, but we're assuming it would be offset for our net zero.
I think we do need some baseline energy supply other than this renewable energy that depends on the weather, a lot of other things. And also we need energy supply without a need for storage like batteries. And you need to look at the other side of the equation. We really, for country power supply, half of them need to be stored in battery or other forms or chemical forms. It will be very expensive and also costly. So we do need some baseline power supply, whether it's hydro or nuclear. The nuclear is proven technology. It's a matter of we want to do it or not.
And the timeframes to build nuclear
Yes.
from today, realistically, it can't contribute.
True. Very
it's
true.
Just,
yes.
I've watched Hinkley B go up. A colleague of mine works there, and it's taken them 10 years from a station that was already there.
Yeah,
So it's just not practical in our current existence. There's no time. And we are out of time. There is no time. I want to thank our fabulous panel. We sort of jumped around a bit, but back to Beth. It all interconnects, you know, everything we do, whether it impacts our water, our oceans, our power supplies, our manufacturing, they are all part of an overall picture, and we can't fiddle with any part of the system without another part being impacted. So I think that's the kind of overall message really from this panel. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.